All right, so that's your arteries. Now we can kind of go back up to our objective list and look for our veins. And when it comes to the veins, a lot of them are pretty much the same. A lot of the same nomenclature regions that we're supplying, but we're going to change a couple different things. So superior vena cava, that is obviously supplying blood back to the heart. I'm not going to show you again. I'll show you real quick. It's really quick, easy one. So superior vena cava coming back to the heart here. So this is this major vein coming back to the heart. So we can label it right here. Superior vena cava. All right, so coming back to the heart. The inferior vena cava would be below that, but we're not going to be able to label that based on everything getting kind of conjumbled together here. All right, and then we have our brachiocephalic veins. And so we'll go ahead and say that one right here because we're going to do this one before it branches. So we don't have anything branching, so I put one in. Brachiocephalic veins. Or you could even say trunk, but we're going to say brachiocephalic veins because that's what your lab manual says. And then that branches into the subclavian vein and the jugular. So our brachiocephalic here branches into our jugular. We're going to call it the internal jugular. Internal jugular. And our subclavian. So I'll say left here because it's on the left side, but you will only be responsible for understanding that it's subclavian, left subclavian vein. And then we branch even further from our subclavian into our axillary vein and our cephalic vein. And the cephalic vein, that one's an interesting one because it's not actually truly supplying the, I mean, it's a cephalic, so anytime you think of cephalic, you think of like in the neck or, brachiocephalic. But in this scenario, we're thinking shoulder region, all right? So cephalic vein. And then branching a little bit further, we're going to have a little bit more, when it comes down to it, we're going to have our brachial vein. The brachial is coming off of that axillary. So our axillary branches, and we have our brachial vein supplying the biceps brachii area. And then if we just stick to the arm for a little bit here, this is blocked off because you don't actually need to know it, but this would be probably like the ulnar vein or the radial vein. We're going to stay away from that though. All right, same thing with this one over here because we don't need to know that one. It's not part of our list, all right? Then we can go up a little bit further here and look right below the heart. These regions are going to be associated with the liver and kidneys and spleen again here. So we're just going to call this one a hepatic vein. And this one here is one last vein that you need to know when it comes to the arm. We're going to call it the median cubital. All right, so it's going to be bringing blood back from the hand regions. Medial cubital vein. And then looking over here, we have our inferior vena cava. Looks a little congested in here, but we're able to stick it in right before coming into the heart, inferior vena cava. And then renal veins. These would be branching equally on both sides bilaterally to one of each kidneys. And then just like we did in the arteries, we have our common iliac branching into our internal iliac and what would be the external iliac vein. We're not going to label it though, but we will label this one here. This is a pretty important one. This is where a lot of pooling occurs and people that aren't moving their bodies enough. You got to move your bodies to move the muscles to squeeze the veins back because they don't have a high pressure. So the great saphenous vein is where a lot of blood pooling occurs in people's legs, especially down here. And then we can get the femoral vein as well, supplying or bringing blood back from, I should say, our femur or our thigh region. And we don't need to know all these other ones. So veins are a little bit looser when it comes down to it. So these are the ones you got to know when it comes to the veins of the body. And now this is all I have when it comes to labeling for this lab, but there are a few other things that we should discuss here. So I'm going to go ahead and just zoom in here with this one, and we'll go a single page. So we did all of objective 2 and objective 1, and now we can look a little bit closer at our brain, our cerebral circulation, our cranial circulation. It looks like a lot, you just got to break it down. All right, so this is what we're looking at, the underside of the brain, and we're taking a snapshot of the main vasculature in the middle. We don't need to know all the other goodies. All right, so there's a lot going on here, and we don't need to know all of these. You only need to know these ones. So we have our common carotid arteries. All right, so we kind of branched over that when it came to our labeling. But if we look for it, we can look for our, here's our interior carotid. All right, so that means that that branched off of something else. Where is the exterior? Oh, it's not labeled here. Okay, well then I must not need to know it when it comes to this particular diagram. All right, so you won't be asked about the external carotid artery on this diagram. You will be asked about it on something like the other diagram that we labeled. But the internal carotid, you will need to know this main vasculature here. And then we have our anterior cerebral arteries. So we have our anterior, so this is anterior toward the front of the brain. Cerebral, so going to the cerebrum, the outside part of the brain, right? A lot of that gray matter. So anterior cerebral arteries toward the top here. Don't need to know the communicating one, so you can just scratch that one down. You don't need to know that one. You need to know the middle cerebral artery, all right? And you do need to know the posterior cerebral artery. So if you think about that, we have our posterior going more toward the back of the brain. We have our middle cerebral artery, and then we have our anterior. These together make a circle. And that's basically the circle of Willis. All right, this is the circle of Willis. It's this little circle here. Your anterior cerebral artery, your middle cerebral artery. Don't count the internal carotid there. This would be going down, toward you. If we're looking at this page, this internal carotid would be going toward you, right? So this is how blood gets to the brain. But then it connects this middle cerebral artery to the posterior cerebral artery. And this circular nature is that circle of Willis here, okay? So on like the quiz, it would give like a highlighted region here, a big circle, and say, what is this region? You would say the circle of Willis. If it pointed to this and said, what is this artery? You would say the posterior cerebral artery. All right. So there's that. And then this big guy in the middle here, this is just your basilar artery. All right. And then your vertebral artery, if you think about this, this would be kind of supplying from the backside. So this is going to be kind of thinking about cervical vertebra, on the bottom of the head, connecting the skull to the spine. So the cervical vertebra would be supplied by these vertebral arteries. All right, so you got your anterior, middle, and posterior cerebral arteries making your circle of Willis. Your basilar artery connecting those to then your vertebral artery. All right, so that's it. You don't need to know anymore. You do need to know the external and internal carotids and jugulars for the other diagrams. You only need to know the internal carotid for this diagram, just this big circle, this big gaping circle here, or hole here. But other than that, this one's pretty straightforward. It looks like a lot. Go in and scratch everything off that you don't need to know, or maybe just kind of put a sticky note on it or something, because maybe you want to use this manual for another class in the future or something. But yeah, pretty straightforward. Just got to connect everything together. Objective 4, we did all this in our labeling. And now objective 5, we did that in our labeling. And then objective 6 here. So this looks, again, more complicated than it actually is. Stick to what is labeled here. All right, you don't need to memorize the flow, but understanding the flow will help you understand what you're looking at. So I'll go ahead and describe the flow a little bit. So think about oxygenated blood coming from the placenta entering into the right atrium via the inferior vena cava. This is totally different than what the adult non-fetal heart would look like, right? We would only have non-oxygenated blood coming in through this way. But instead, we've got this placenta, all right? This placenta is going to be coming into the heart here, into the liver, and then into the heart. So it's going to be supplying the oxygenated blood through the receiving valve here and cutting the pulmonary circulation off, so the lungs are not really involved in the circulation here. So we get oxygenated blood coming in, and it mixes with the non-oxygenated. And then we have this foramen ovale. All right, so this foramen is just a hole in the heart that, if it's not sealed, becomes a congenital heart defect. But as a child, or for a baby that's connected to mom, they need this hole here in order to get the blood from this side of the heart, from the inferior vena cava and then the right atrium, over into the left atrium. So it connects the atria. So that atrial septum is what's closing up this foramen ovale, or ovale, however you want to pronounce it. All right, so then blood is able to go through and enter into the pulmonary and the aortic trunks, but we don't actually want it to go to the lungs, and so this ductus arteriosus connects the aorta with the pulmonary artery, making sure that blood is shunted away from the lungs and going into the aorta so that we can pump oxygenated blood to everything for baby. All right. And so what we just described there was our umbilical vein bringing blood to the heart, right? Vein, so it's oxygenated blood to the heart. Umbilical arteries are taking blood away from the heart. All right. So this umbilical cord is going to contain the arteries and the umbilical veins. And so the arteries are going to take the blood away from the heart. Ductus venosus is going to be shunting oxygenated blood from the placenta away from the not fully functional liver and toward the heart. All right. And then our foramen ovale is going to make sure that our heart atria are connected. And then our ductus arteriosus makes sure the aorta and the pulmonary artery are connected so that we're shunting blood away from the lungs. So you just need to break it down, what they are, where you might find them, and that'll help you understand what you're looking at. This particular diagram isn't super useful for testing purposes. So in our folder, our lab folder, there are models. Use those models, especially the one for the fetal, to try to piece apart what you're looking at for preparation for the quiz. All right. And then looking ahead here, this is everything that we kind of labeled. Again, there's a lot here. You do not need to know all of this. So don't use this during your quiz and say, what's he looking at? Point to that. All right, let's do that. Because we don't need to necessarily know all of these. All right, we didn't need to know the vertebral artery, not until it was in that portion of the brain, the way that we were looking at it. We didn't need to know the fibular artery or the plantar arch. Okay, we didn't need to know all the vein ones either. Look at all these veins. We didn't need to know all those. We needed to know half of them. So stick to the descriptions that we used during this presentation, the things that we labeled. Make sure you know what is in your lab manual objective lists, and then look at the diagrams to supplement your learning. But that's all I have for you. Other than that, have a wonderful week.